Welcome to the African Plants Georeferencing Train the Trainers workshop. In this video, we introduce biodiversity data standards and, in particular, the Darwin Core Standard. To begin, we're going to ask ourselves what a standard is. We can think of standards as norms, conventions, specifications, or even requirements. They are sets of shared rules, a common language, that provide clarity and ultimately help us to communicate. That is, they facilitate the correct interpretation of the information among people and also allow computers to interpret data and facilitate access to them. There are many standards. Let's look at a particular example, geographic coordinates. In this case, we have a series of numbers ordered in a certain way, and we can identify a series of standards in use. For example, we can say that what we're looking at is a measurement, it is a geographic coordinate. We can say that it has a format in degrees, minutes, and seconds instead of, for example, in decimal degrees. Also, we are using a particular numerical system, sexagesimal, and we use certain numbers, Indo-Arabic. We use certain language, in this case English, as we can see in the letters that indicate a hemisphere, with certain alphabet symbols, typographic Latin. We can also determine the font, in this case Arial, and not, for example, Times New Roman, etc. As we can see, many standards are involved in expressing that single geographic coordinate. Now, what types of standards do we usually use when dealing with data? There are many types of standards, and here we're going to mention only some of them. There are standards on the types of data that refer to the restrictions on the values of the fields. For example, if we're talking about text, about dates, if we're talking about Boolean data types. There are also standards regarding the values of the data, which are restrictions regarding the values that we can use in certain fields. For example, in the case of geographic coordinates, and if we talk in particular about latitude, it can only take values between -90 and 90. There are format standards, which refer to restrictions in the representations of the data. An example could be if we express a date as year, month, and day, and how many digits we use to describe each one. Standards referring to the character encoding are rules that tell us how we interpret the bytes that we're using. Other types of standards are application schemes, which describe combinations of standards we use with data and with datasets, format standards, which constrain the file structure, and transfer protocols, which help us determining where and how we share content. Before continuing, let's refresh some key concepts about biodiversity data that will be important to keep in mind when we talk about particular standards. Biodiversity data are organized into data sets. We could think of them as a spreadsheet with different columns and rows. The dataset is described by metadata, which is a file where one expresses what the dataset is about. What is the title, what is the organization that produces the data, etc. Within the dataset, we have a collection of records. That is, each row corresponds to a particular record. And within those records, we have fields. In other words, a record is a collection of fields or properties, and within each field, we find values for those properties. Summarizing, we have datasets that are described by metadata. Those datasets are made up of records, which have fields, and for each field, in each record, there will be a certain value. This is important to keep in mind because at all of those levels, dataset, metadata, records, fields, and values, some rules or standards can be applied. Now, which standards do we use for biodiversity data? We use some global standards, widely used by the whole community, and some standards that are a little more restricted, can be local, regional, or thematic. For example, if we deal with data on marine species, it is possible that we will use some standards that do not necessarily apply to terrestrial specimens. Some of the standards we use are developed by the biodiversity data community, and others are taken from other disciplines. For example, to name countries, we use standards that come from the geographic discipline, not necessarily from the biodiversity branch. Our community's own standards are developed and maintained by an organization called Biodiversity Information Standards, also known as TADWIG. On the TADWIG website, you can explore how the organization works and which are the standards that we develop and maintain. Among the entire list of standards that are developed and maintained by TADWIG, we will highlight one that is perhaps the most used one within the community, the Darwin Core Standard. The rest of this video will focus on describing this standard and how to use it. Let's start by asking ourselves, what is the Darwin Core Standard? The Darwin Core Standard is a list of terms or fields. We can think of them as, for example, the column headers on a spreadsheet, and their definitions related to biodiversity data. That list of terms can seem infinite to us, and in a way, we could even think of it as a black box when we first get in touch with the standard. However, terms are organized categorically into term classes. For example, within the simple Darwin Core, we have term classes that refer to the event, to the location, to the geological context, to the taxon, etc. So, if we go back to our black box, we can distinguish groups of terms that are within those classes. And if we look carefully, we will surely identify some terms with which we may be quite familiar. We will explore a little how these terms are displayed on the standards web page. On this page are listed all the terms within each class. Now, let's look at a particular term to understand the elements included in the standard. Our example is the term country. Each term has an identifier and a definition. In the particular case of country, it will be the name of the country or major administrative division in which the location occurs. Also, the term has a series of comments about the use of the term and examples of values that could fit under this term. For these and other terms, among the comments, there is a recommendation to use controlled vocabularies. This means that for this term, we should use certain values that are previously agreed upon in the community. The use of controlled vocabularies improves the quality of the data because it allows us to find the information more easily. Using this country term as an example, if we use the value Ghana, spelled out, as the country value, or GHA period, we may all understand that we are perhaps referring to the same country, Ghana. But when we look for those data in a database, we would necessarily need to know those two values to get all possible results matching Ghana. Therefore, we agree to use Ghana, writing the whole word so that it is easier to access, discover, and use information. Now, thinking of all the terms included in Darwin Core, it is fair to ask if it is necessary to use them all. And the answer is no. It is not necessary to use all Darwin Core terms. For example, if we're sharing information about a contemporary preserved specimen, it would not make much sense to use terms that refer to the geological context, as they will probably have those fields always empty. The question that immediately arises is then which Darwin Core terms to use and when. The answer is that one should use as many as possible whenever it makes sense. As many as possible implies that one tries to share as much information as possible in as many ways as possible, as we will see later in the video. However, there is a difference between using the standard at the source of the data, that is to say, in our own local databases, and using it when sharing the data with the rest of the community. When sharing, using a standard is essential because it allows us to exchange the information so that the person or computer who receives it understands what it's about. At the source, however, we have to be careful because we must not forget that internal databases should be useful to our daily uses. For example, if we speak French, we may want to have a field in our database called année and not year. Another example could be if we have internal fields in our collection, for instance, the number of the shelf where the containers with specimens are kept. This does not have an equivalent in Darwin Core, but it may still be a very useful field for our daily work. And so, we don't necessarily have to force our database to use Darwin Core. Now, if we don't use Darwin Core in our databases, but we need it when it comes to share the data, at some point we will need to map our original fields to the standard. We will walk through a quick, simple example of the possible types of field mappings we can perform. In this example, we have an original field that we call date, with a value of 9 May 1985. This field can have a direct mapping to a term in Darwin Core, verbatim event date, which refers to the date of event as it was originally recorded. In this case, the value of that field in Darwin Core will be equal to the value in our original field. Now, there are also possible indirect mappings to other Darwin Core terms, and these mappings can involve transformations of the data. An example is from that original date field to try to complete the field event date. The definition of this field in Darwin Core expects that the date be in a certain format. Therefore, we cannot simply repeat the value that we had in the original field. Instead, a transformation is necessary to comply with the standard, from the original date to the ISO-formatted date. Other types of mapping could involve splitting the information in the original field to complete other separate fields for year, month, and day, and start and end day of year. Conversely to splitting, some mappings may involve merging or concatenating information from two or more fields into a single one. For example, if we have two fields in our database, one which captures whether we have a skin of a specimen and another one that indicates if we have tissues, there are no terms in Darwin Core to express this data separately. Instead, there is a single field for preparations, which requires to enter data in a certain format. We then need to transform our original data to be able to share them using the Darwin Core Standard. To map correctly, it is essential to know the original data, that is, what each field means, what type of data they contain, what those data refer to, and to know the standard, the definitions of the terms in the standard, and which are the requirements for each term. Now, surely, we're going to find some fields that we cannot map directly nor indirectly to the standard. What do we do in these cases? One possible solution is not to share this information. An example of this could be the shelf number, which may not be relevant outside our institution. Another option is to include this data in general fields, if appropriate. For example, there are a series of terms in Darwin Core that correspond to remarks, such as occurrence remarks, location remarks, georeference remarks, etc. Also, the term dynamic properties is a general field that can accommodate several different types of information. Finally, some of the data that do not map to simple Darwin Core can be shared using Darwin Core extensions, which we're not going to explain in this video. For more information about extensions, please see the video linked in the description. This has been a very quick introduction to data standards and to the Darwin Core Standard. We will get into much more detail of its use for georeferencing purposes in our following lessons. We hope you have enjoyed this video and thank you for watching.